ouve-se. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure and a great honor also to welcome Professor Jane Buisktra. Professor Jane Buisktra is a member of the American Academy of Sciences, is a reference in the fields such as paleopatology, forensic anthropology also, and her work has been cited more than 5,000 times. It's really a great reference, so it's very good to have here Professor Jane Buisktra with us. I'm grateful to the School of Science and Technology of the University of Évora, as well as to the Research Center for Anthropology and Health from the Coimbra University. So let's listen Professor Buisktra talking us about inequality in the beginning of democracy. Os estudantes que pretenderem certificado de participação assinam uma das folhas que vai estar em circulação. Quem foi convocado para uma aula assina a outra folha de presença que vai circular. Let's listen to Professor Jane Buisktra.
Thank you, Professor Fernandez, for your gracious introduction. I'm delighted to be here in your beautiful city for the first time. I do love being in Portugal because the warmth of the people, the good food, and the wonderful audiences that I had the pleasure of talking to. So, can you hear me in the back? Is everything good? Okay, thank you very much. You know, what I'm going to talk about today, the title's changed a little bit, but we're going to talk about inequality and democracy at the time that we in the Western world recognize the beginning of democracy. And we find that democracy and equality really went hand in hand. And this is something I'm studying from the side of the people who were at the disenfranchised end of the continuum, the people that have no voices in the literature, whose history is only discoverable through archaeology. And that's what I feel my vocation is here. What I'd like to do with the lecture is begin by talking a little bit about what bioarchaeology is. That's my approach. It's really what I call peopling the past, trying to really focus on the lives of the individuals who, in this case, were the folks upon whose backs democracy, as we know it, was built. I'll talk about ancient Greece, archaic Greece, where the site I'm studying is lodged temporally or chronologically. We'll talk about the site of Phaleron that I'm analyzing at the moment, its excavation history, bioarchaeological study to date, in other words, fast-breaking news that hasn't been published yet. And we'll meet some of the people of Phaleron. So what is bioarchaeology? What is this approach that I've been championing for 50 years or more? I happened to name it in 1977. And although I wasn't attached to the name, I was attached to the fact that what we need to do if we're interrogating the past is to focus on a series of topics, of questions, and not let our methodologies, our specialties get in the way of answering those questions. Because universities and training programs particularly at that time, had a lot of silos. We had archaeology silos over here, physical or biological anthropology silos over there. And what really seemed to me to be most productive was to break down the walls of those silos and bring the methods together as appropriate to answer specific questions about social organization, disease, demography, health, and so on. So you might ask the question, well, you study human bones. Well, yes, I do. So do you study, is bioarchaeology the study of bones from archaeological sites? No, I would answer, context is crucial. We need to, again, focus on the people. We need to be problem-oriented and focused on individual and group histories. We are informed by archaeological, or as we may say, prehistoric archaeology, or historical contexts. We may be scientific or humanistic in our approaches, and sometimes combining the two in interesting ways. But the question is, who are the people that we're studying? And we can address numerous topics about them, ranging from ethnicity and political formations to diet and health, and be truly interdisciplinary and sometimes bring this knowledge from deep time to questions that are important today. Break down some of the essentialist stigma that we attach to certain groups of people. In the past, folks didn't do that, and it's thus this normative perspective some folks have really is misplaced and is not pan-human. So in the 21st century, bioarchaeology seems to have taken off as an approach, which delights me. There are a lot of people working in the field in different areas and a lot of different approaches. But I really think there's a strength in this diversity. And if I don't agree with everybody, that's fine. I think we learn more when we have a lot of voices addressing issues that are important today and important in the past. Now, you may have heard the term bioarchaeology used a bit differently, particularly here in Europe. Graham Clark, in the early 1970s, used the term in reference to the study of faunal remains, non-human animals. And then that was extended to palynology, the study of pollen plants in archaeological contexts and so forth. But today, even in the UK and in places in Europe and really across the globe, in China and throughout South America, the bioarchaeology of human beings, of people, has really become important and the dominant theme. Now, I'm going to take you through, if you're like I was and didn't really have a specialty in classical studies, and I needed to learn more about, and I still need to learn a lot more about ancient Greece and the way it's been studied and interpreted. But with just a thumbnail sketch here, we can see that, or I'll start my chronological discussion around 1600 years before the Common Era. In other words, 3,600 years ago. With the Mycenaean people, the palatial period it was, where you had a clear dichotomy between the people who lived and ruled from palaces and those that fed them and took care of them. Burials at that point in time were frequently in large beehive, so-called tombs, and the burials were commingled ultimately. They were mixed together and seemed to be of all people. Some of the marvelous craft items included gold masks and so on. The Palatial period gave way to what's sometimes termed a series of dark ages, which a term we don't use that much anymore. But for example, we have the geometric period after the fall or demise of the Mycenaean period. And this was a period still of considerable artistic achievement and ceramic elaboration, so-called geometric period because of the geometric designs on ceramics. The Archaic period that we'll be talking about, because that's where Phaleron is situated in time, and also, as we'll see, a very interesting time where the balance of power shifted a lot between those who were the oligarchs who had inherited power and wealth and political control, and various upstart groups who really wanted to assume that political control. So we see a lot of evidence of trauma, of violence between people either within communities or across political divides. And so this is a record of violence, but there's much more to be talked about, and that's what we're looking at when we're talking about the people from the site of Phaleron. Now here we're drilling down to Archaic Greece, between the first really organized Olympics in around 766 BCE and extending to the classical period, which began about 480 BCE, or before the Common Era, before the birth of Christ. And this is a time when you have a number of recorded revolts, again, of the people against the oligarchs, groups, political groups that are attempting to take over. The Cylon coup is one that is recorded for 632 BCE. You have folks attempting to legislate Draco's laws, for example, most of which were very draconian in the sense that many specified the loss of life. You have attempts to legislate control, structure, laws, and you have folks such as Solon, who may or may not have been a person, but there are considerable writings and poetry attributed to him or a group that assumed that name. He's important because he freed the indentured servants or slaves and attempted to create a council based on wealth again. The hierarchy was based on wealth, but not on inherited power. And that was elaborated again by Cleisthenes with a larger council and more legislative reforms. The important takeaway here is a lot of changing political power, economic power, and interactions between people that were sometimes positive and other times agonistic. This was also a time when coins were beginning to be used, influence from the Middle East. You have land armies of hoplites who were affected on land. And you have, during the Archaic period, the beginning of the establishment of colonies as ancient Greece began to assume increasing power in the Mediterranean. Since we're interested here in cemeteries, or that's the basis of our analysis, we're interested in what they represent. And there's been a trend through archaeology until fairly recently, to assume that the cemeteries reflect all the dead of the people at the time. So fewer cemeteries, fewer people, etc. And that doesn't really work. What we seem to have is locational variation between cemeteries. So if you dig in the city of Athens, for example, you'll find elaborate tombs of the elite. But certainly those weren't the only people who supported Athens. And the tensions and the exclusion of certain people from burial in Athens is what has created the Phaleron cemetery, just a few clicks from Athens, but on the Bay of Phaleron, as you see there. And also, we must say, of course, there is a port there, but there is no large community. Certainly not sufficiently large to create the vast number of burials, nearly 2,000, in this cemetery that lasted only a few centuries. The first excavations at Phaleron were in the 19th century, but really the first systematic ones were in the early 20th century. And they discovered at that time, as our archaeologists did more recently, series of burials that seemed to reflect individuals that had been executed or had been enslaved with shackles and so forth, some apparently having been treated to a crude beginning form of crucifixion where the individuals were attached to boards rather than crosses. But again, evidence certainly of death by violence, apparently sustained by the state. Now, in around 2010, the New Archives Foundation decided to build a cultural center in this area near the Bay of Phaleron. And the land at that point had been a racetrack. It had not been developed. And imagine their surprise to find that there were archaeological resources there. Here's a picture of the center, which houses an opera house, library, and so on. It was built very quickly, and the rescue archaeology had to proceed very quickly as well. So between 2012 and 2015, the Ministry of Culture excavated remains from the late geometric to the end of the classic period, as you see there. And we have more than 15,000 skeletons. The work that we're doing has focused only on the 1,037 that were excavated during 2012 to 2013. But we too, aside from the individual graves, have a series of individuals who were executed. In fact, if you've heard of the Phaleron Project, it's these individuals who are called the individuals of the Esplanada, the 3 rows of executed men that has caught the public's attention. But these 78 individuals are only a part of the picture. Again, we have 1,037 that include a large number of individuals. And we compare these, the executed individuals, the individuals buried in the shallow pits, with the cemeteries, the people buried in the cemeteries in Athens, who were apparently the elite, and their relationship genetically, health-wise, and so on. We don't know how similar or dissimilar they were, and this is something that we're pursuing. We have a variety of forms of graves, aside from the executed individuals. They include a few funeral pyres, a few animal burials, some pit graves that are aligned, some pottery containers with burials, and a lot of pot burials, which are of juvenile individuals. When I saw this initial estimate of the types of burials and noted that there were a lot of pot burials, that is, immature individuals, and in proportionate to the adults, I assumed this was going to be a normal cemetery and that there would be no demographic biases toward certain age or sex groups. And I'm happy to report I'm wrong again. There are some biases, and they're interesting, so I guess that's the good news. We do have animal burials, and if you get to Athens before April 30th, there's a lovely exhibit at the American School of Classical Studies that Jennifer Niles figured there has put together, talking about the horse in ancient Athens, and including information and a recreation of the horse burial you see there. Just to bring this into our realm, I was delighted to be able to, from my home in the western United States, access our digital records for conservation when Jennifer asked about the nature of the children, who was buried in the vicinity of the horse burials or with ceramics that figured horses. And we have a lot of those within these pots, as you see there in the center of the screen. And I was able to pull up the information and indicate the age of death of the children, and also note that several of them had changes in the cranial vault that looked like they had a severe or perhaps inherited anemia. I'll come back to that point in a moment. We have a number of ceramics, as I've mentioned, jar burials, and we do have some older individuals with grave goods that allow us to estimate the time period with some precision. But we're on what the archaeologists call the Hallstatt Plateau, which means we can't use radiocarbon dating to estimate the chronology for our burials. So we have to use ceramics, which happily do have a precision in dating that is greater, actually, more precise than radiocarbon dating after much laborious work in the 20th century by folks that study ceramics. So we're able to use these for our graves that have grave goods to allow us to establish some relative chronology and the horizontal spread of the site, which is critical if we're going to really talk about the people and change through time. Now, this is what we were blessed with following the excavations. We were given approximately 1,600 crates containing unexcavated human remains that required considerable conservation prior to study, and no funding from the Niarchos Foundation. More pots there. So we've assembled a team of conservators and really trained a team of conservators, because in Greece most of the conservation training is in inorganics, the marble, the pots. And so we've trained a new generation of folks that are looking at organic remains and are able to conserve bones quite nicely. So in asking the question, who are the people of Phaleron, as we conserve the remains, we're taking a lot of time to carefully document, clean and document, for example, the thorax, the chest area. Not only does this give us some positional information about the, let's see if that works, about the position of the shoulders when the individual was buried. For example, this individual has a very unusually raised shoulder. We also are taking great effort to make sure we can identify the ribs and rib fragments such that we can talk about where sharp force trauma entered the body, separate the patterning of changes on the interior aspect of the thorax that may more completely represent tuberculosis signals versus cancer, and so on. So we've made that effort, and I think it will indeed pay off. We, of course, are doing the standard osteobiographical biological sex estimations and adding to that DNA studies. And we're finding a lot more. We have only males in the executed individuals, but we also have so far a disproportionate number of individuals dying as young adult males in the core area of the site. They had difficult lives as we read their pathologies, but they died as young adults, much more than the females are represented. We're also experimenting with some techniques, proteomic techniques, that should allow us to estimate sex in juvenile individuals, which will be quite revealing, I think. Looking at age at death, and we find, for example, when we look at the 3 rows of executed individuals, these are mostly young adult individuals that died as young adults and were male. All were male, but there are a few outliers that are relatively interesting. And to get a little bit ahead of the game, it's one of these that's a foreigner, somebody from afar that was born somewhere else in the Mediterranean and ended up within these executed individuals. There's quite a bit of size variation even within a line of burials, which suggests that, again, that there's a diverse background that we hope to be able to tease out by looking at ancient DNA. Again, small to larger individuals, even within small areas of the site. And although we haven't gotten there yet, we will be looking at biological kin relations in the cemetery by looking at inherited features of the teeth. Again, as you do emplace chemical signatures of the places you grew up in your teeth, the groundwater, which reflects an isotope signature here, strontium 87 to 86, this groundwater varies across the globe based on the bedrock age wherever you were born. And you can see in the map there that in Europe and then in Greece, you have quite a bit of variation in the bedrock signals, which would be carried up through the groundwater and would leave signatures in your deciduous teeth, but in your adult teeth as well, of your infant years, your childhood years, and your young adolescent years. We're working through these data at this point, but there are individuals within this executed group that did not grow up in Attica. We're looking at indications of activities, which we can read in various ways, written on the bone. One way that people are experimenting with, and certainly the folks at Coimbra have been at the forefront of this effort, is by looking at areas of muscle attachment and degree of development and shape and so on in providing indications of activity and relative activity and so on. I've been working with or collaborating with the Tübingen group, University of Tübingen in Germany, who have been focusing upon areas of muscle attachment in hands. And they've been particularly, Alexandros Karakostas figured here, but what he's done has been looking at experimental models, looking at people of known occupation from medieval sites and 19th century sites, and just simply contrasting the classic power and precision grips in terms of the development of areas of muscle attachment, and looking at 3D images and quantifying this. And again, he's developed a mapping based on individuals of known occupation that separate occupations of folks who were working with anvils, working with heavy equipment, versus those who are simply working with their hands in precision artisanry. So you can separate on this map, for example, the doorman from the mill builder, the woodcutter, and so on. So you have a distinction across those two activity types. We've been comparing the folks that are buried that appear to have died violently. And what we find is a distinction with the others, and we find a distinction between the two in terms of power and precision grips. The folks that died violently appear to have used a power grip that you might think about associated with rowers or the military or farmers or people who work with metal and so on. And the precision grip of the other folks who could have been folks working as artisans, working as slaves, keeping records, and so forth and so on. But we do see an activity difference. We are looking at evidence of activity differences in osteoarthritis, the bone-on-bone polish or hibernation, lipping, porosity, and so on. Right now, I'm puzzled by a lipping that we're seeing in a lot of our individuals dying as adult males, lipping at the top of the second cervical vertebrae of the neck and then in the adjacent facet. So there's something they're doing with their heads that I haven't gotten any orthopedic surgeons to cough up a reason for. So any of you have ideas, I'm all ears. We're also looking at cross-sectional diameters, but again, I don't have any results for you. What I do have are observations about sharp force trauma that's healed, well healed. And I do have an opinion from an orthopedist that this was medically treated with fragments removed and so on. This isn't the only sharp force trauma. This is as well. That's not a suture. We are asking questions about the execution of these folks in the graves. You see on the top of many of these skulls an indentation which the archaeologist has unequivocally interpreted as evidence of blunt force trauma. I'm willing to be convinced, but when you look at the edges of the bone, the color of the edges, the shape of the way in which you'd have to see blunt force trauma radiate across the skull, I'm not convinced forensically. And so we're looking at these skulls very intensively. And there's a master's student at Tübingen who's going to reconstruct these through 3D imaging and then also look at angles and give us a much more serious view of this. We're also studying cancers and doing it systematically, not just looking at the more florid external expressions of bone cancers, but actually doing systematic x-rays that will allow us to get a real sense of the degree to which cancer was prevalent in this ancient population that would have been exposed, for example, to lead from the mines in south of Attica and so on. We're aging, of course, the juveniles. As I mentioned, we're using proteomics to estimate sex. And we're looking, we're puzzled by what we're finding in terms of the clear difference between the treatment of the male, of the individuals, male and female, who are buried in the shallow pits with no grave goods, which is the predominant burial form at this site, and these children, mainly infants, who are buried in vessels and frequently with as many as 3 small pots with them. The traditional interpretation has been, oh, you have high-status kids and low-status adults, and I'm not sure that I want to interpret the site that way, because I don't know of cemeteries where that's really the case. So there's something else going on here in terms of spatial organization, and also the relationship, of course, between the people that are burying, the families that are burying the children, and then the groups that are burying the adults. And I think we need to rethink that assumption. I think there's something more subtle going on. In terms of the children, we are seeing, well, we're seeing a lot of pathology in all the individuals. In a lot of the kids, we're seeing this lipping around the ends of the growing long bones, which leaves this radiolucency on x-rays and looks very like x-rays that are taken of children with scurvy. And scurvy, of course, we think of as vitamin C deficiency. I think this isn't that expressly. I think there's a metabolic problem that expresses as this kind of bony change. But I think we need to rethink the linking between vitamin C deficiency. I think there's a suite of metabolic problems that lead to this kind of change. So I think that's another example of where we need to go back to the drawing board. We have evidence of inherited anemias. These are examples of known cases, but we have cranial vault changes that are clearly extreme for any kind of nutritional anemia. And I think once we pull the information together, will help inform us about malaria as well. We have a lot of inflammation in the sinuses, as you can see there. A lot of pulmonary distress. Again, remodeling on the inside of the ribs from young individuals dying as young adults. So life was not easy for these people that were buried at Phaleron. And to look at individual cases, let's meet a few of those. Here's a male who died probably as a young to middle-aged adult. He shows evidence of what we term a perifracture, or a fracture of the forearm that never quite healed And along with that, on the same side of his body, he has a healed fracture of a rib. Another individual who died as a young adult male, hand missing from the photograph, but here you see evidence of an amputated finger. A middle-aged male who suffered extreme trauma to his pelvic area, broke his, has a compression fracture in his back. Part of his hip bone fractured and then has remodeled and healed. And then the sacrum at the back of the pelvis shows the same. But what's impressive, especially impressive to me, is that the fracture's healed and you see evidence of lipping that must have occurred after that fracture he had healed. So he went back to work, whatever that work was. But I don't know that he had a lot of pain, but I'm thinking that he did, and he played through it. An older adult male as evidence of a penetrating trauma here that was likely treated. A lot of, as you see there, a lot of wear on his teeth. And again, a healed fracture. And this is the life of these people as expressed in their deaths. Now, I've just begun, because it took us a great deal of time just to conserve the material, but we've begun to accumulate our digital database. And I've been comparing the folks that were, well, we have 10 individuals that were taken up and we didn't have to study in situ. And I've studied those along with others that were executed buried in other places of the site. And then the similar age-matched sample of men from the pit graves. And what I'm doing is looking for evidence of physical and structural trauma or violence. Physical trauma, of course, is easy to read and obvious in the postcranial skeleton and in the skull. But we can think of other kinds of trauma that results from the structures of society, the economic structures, the social structures of society that predispose individuals to work intensively while others don't. And so we're looking for evidence of that structural trauma, evidence of illness when these folks grew up, that's written in teeth and bones in their adulthood or in their childhood. Evidence of disease as adults, evidence of disease as children. So in any case, I'm looking at evidence of particular physical trauma that's represented in the bone and other osteobiographic evidence of structural trauma or of disease that these individuals suffered from and recovered from in some cases not. So in this comparison across the two groups, those that were executed or buried unusually, and those in the simple pit graves, we find some interesting contrasts. We find a lot of healed or not healed cranial trauma, not surprisingly maybe, in these individuals that were executed, yet not in those that are buried in the pit graves. They've suffered a lot of evidence of occupational trauma or interpersonal trauma, maybe, but mostly the kind of trauma one might gain in various kinds of occupations you would imagine during that period of time. We find that those in the pit graves have recovered from a large number of childhood illnesses, which is not reflected in the group over here. We see this in lines of what we call linear enamel hyperplasias, but lines of dental defects here that represent those episodes. We find a lot of evidence of cribra orbitalia, which is associated with anemias, and it expresses its porosity in the cranial vault, as you see here, and almost ubiquitous tibial periostitis or evidence of inflammation even among young males, individuals dying as young males. And finally, what we've definitely determined, we did not do the field observations. There was a Swedish team that had the permit for that, and this is not to cast aspersions, but they did a very thorough job of looking at the individuals in situ, and they've been left in situ, and they're deteriorating to the point they won't be observable very soon, but that's not my decision. The 10 individuals were taken up, and we observed those, and they tell a very different story than was told to the Swedish team when they observed them in situ. So for those who think that you get a similar viewpoint by looking at materials in situ and why take them up, for those archaeologists and others, I have a message. So that's what I have to share with you this afternoon. And I'd like to thank lecture sponsors, colleagues and students, the funding agencies, and various institutions that have supported the work you've heard about here. Thank you.